Welcome, everyone, to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. I'm Josie Iselin, the author of The Curious World of Seaweed, and will be your nominal moderator for a great discussion today entitled, What Comes Naturally? The Science and Soul of Nature Writing. Joining me is Obi Kaufmann, author of the California Field Atlas and the Nature of, and the State of Water. And along with us is John Muir Laws and Emilie Lygren, co-authors of How to Teach Nature Journaling, which has just been released in the past week or so. We are all Heyday Books authors and are from the Bay Area here. So welcome, everyone. This is very exciting for us all to be here. All four of us work along a continuum or the spectrum between art and science and have chosen the book as our muse, I like to think of it. It's a format in which we bring together our passion for the natural world with both words and images. We're all used to doing webinars and these Zoom talks with imagery, but this is really an author's conversation, so an author's panel. So we'll be discussing rather than showing, and we hope that all of you viewers out there will find our books, find our websites, and discover how our visual art combines with this scientific storytelling. So welcome you all. Let's start with introducing ourselves. Again, I am one of the authors here, so I'm just not a real moderator. We're just going to kind of have an open conversation. But let's start with introducing ourselves, talk a bit about our background, our basic process of working. We all do multiple things beyond writing. So what comes first, perhaps? The writing, the painting, the image making. So Emilie, do you want to get us going?
Yes, my name is Emilie Lygren. My pronouns are she, hers, and they, them. And I'm the co-author, as Josie said, of How to Teach Nature Journaling, this book here. And I'm an outdoor science educator, and I'm also a poet. And so a lot of my process is focused on developing tools for students and youth to observe and be present with the world and observe and be present with their own stories. And so for me, the process of writing often begins with observation and attention. And whether I'm working in the field of science or the field of poetry, it's really that kind of baseline of observation where everything else grows from. And the process of inquiry that is a part of science and is a part of poetry, I find is actually quite similar, even though the kind of details are a little bit different. And I have a decade of experience as an outdoor science educator and curriculum developer.
Jack, you want to take over?
Hi there. I'm Jack, and most of my training, my formal training, has been as a scientist, as a wildlife biologist. And I always thought that I would kind of be some sort of Farley Mowat character out there, you know, with an antenna tracking a grizzly bear. But it was interesting the whole time that I was, in school studying. What I found that I really loved was being a teaching assistant. I love teaching. Before I went to grad school, I was doing science education, and when I got out, I realized that that's really what I do. I'm fascinated by the beautiful, the intricate world of science, and it's just this window into this incredible planet that we're on. And I sort of see myself as an interpreter. I can take other people's research and make that accessible. So a lot of what I do is trying to help people get access to that information, but also more than the information is the scientific way of thinking. How can you look at the phenomena that are around you and make meaning out of it? How do you start to figure out things by what you're looking at? My major vehicle is by keeping a notebook. Turns out my brain easily forgets things. And also when I'm just on my own, sitting on a rock and kind of staring, a lot of stuff just flows over me and it doesn't stick in my brain in any way that I can grapple with. So what I do, I'll show you, is as I'm sitting there, I will draw pictures of the things that I see, and I'll make written notes about the observations that I'm making. And so I'm observing, I'm asking questions, I'm making connections with things. So anything that is going on in here, I'm trying to put down onto the page here. And so this ends up being kind of the trampoline for my curiosity, my observations, my inquiry, and creative thinking, just to sort of play around on. So a lot of my process, it looks like not just sitting in a field, but sitting on a field with a notebook in my hands, using words and pictures and numbers to wrap my head around this incredible planet that we're on.
And Jack, did you always draw? Did you draw as a kid? Was it something that was just part of what you did, or was that something that kind of grew out of the process?
I can remember drawing as long as I can kind of remember things. So I think I have been drawing for a long time. A lot of that, though, I wasn't really kind of taking it seriously as a naturalist until somewhere in elementary school, when I was on a field trip with my mom. We're out playing with another botanist, and there's a woman who came along, and she had a notebook. She had a sketchbook. And I was amazed, and I just followed her. She was just drawing pictures of the plants that she saw. And I realized, this is what I want to do. I want in on this. So ever since then, I've been keeping notebooks and journals. The closet behind me has shelves filled with bound journals, just like that one that I held up. That's very much my process. And it started a long time ago, and I've been filling a lot of pages.
Yeah. Obi, how about you?
I am so thrilled to be here with you three right now. It was about 3 or 4 years ago now that I signed with Heyday to make this book, the California Field Atlas. And I remember on that first day going into their offices there in Berkeley, and the acquisitions editor at the time, Lindsay Baer, told me about this book on seaweed that was being made. And she showed me some of the original proofs, and I just thought they were so luminescent. And furthermore, I was in that office because of my fandom for the nature guides of John Muir Laws. Like the idea of being inside the same publishing house, my paintings next to Jack's was a dream come true. And also I'd heard of Emilie's work through the Beetle Project. So I am a huge fan and indeed a student of all three of you. So that being said, I am a painter and a backpacker. I am from California, and my study is all things related to California's natural world and its world-class portfolio of biodiversity. I grew up on Mount Diablo here in the East Bay, and from my childhood, I was fascinating with the idea of mapping, the idea of being able to tell a visual story through topography and cartography. And even that then led into my study of wildlife rendering, which is not unmap-like in its way of directing the eye around a picture plane in order to convey information, and to convey a sense of connectivity, really, of understanding and empathy between beings. And so that being interested in conservation science and getting the message out about protecting what is still here to be protected at all, despite 170 years of post gold rush, the urban veneer that we've so successfully erected across this place called California. And despite all that, what remains, and what in fact will always be here, regardless of how important we might think our little species is. So that getting those big ideas into a book is something that I will continue doing for the rest of my life. And if I could, real fast, I have a really fun announcement to make here today with this panel. I just got the the proof copy of my next book that's going to come out in September, The Forests of California. I'm so excited to share this with you. It's coming in at about 650 fat pages here, so it is quite the doorstep. But and at almost 3 pounds, you don't really want to take it backpacking with you. This is for something to study between adventures. Can
we have a request just to open a couple of pages in that?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, it goes through 50 different arboreal associations. This is all about arboreal habitat across California, from Crescent City to San Diego, all of it, across 30 different habitat types, across 23 national forests and hundreds of watersheds. So it's the same sort of hundreds of hand-painted maps of how nature works around the state, but also a lot of journaling, I'm sure inspired by you guys, a lot of statistics, including extant old growth statistics of different forest types across our, the 50% or so of designated forest that we have in this state. It just goes on and on, right?
And I'd love to come back in a little bit and kind of delve into the relationship of the writing to the image.
I like that one, the salmon, the salmon cycle. Yeah.
These are also these intertwined. We all are these storytellers that are just a little bit different than the manuscript that goes into the publisher that then gets bound and nominally designed and a cover gets put on it. Our process is so different. We're really, it's so cool to see this new book, Obi, because we know, and yours, Jack and Emilie's, because these are things that are built in a way that's different than just sitting at a typewriter.
Your story, Josie, of how you go about this is also fascinating. Give us a little bit of background on the Josie story and what gets your eyes popping out of your head.
Yeah, so I am trained as a visual artist. So I actually have no background in science, technically, in terms of my training. I have no background in science at all. My undergraduate degree was in something called Visual and Environmental Studies, and the environmental studies had nothing to do with environmental science. It actually was a bunch of architects who ran the program. So I did some design courses, but I mostly am a photographer, and got my MFA in photography at San Francisco State in the early 90s, which was a wonderful and exciting time, and had always been working with luminescent, transparent imagery, even back in the analog years. There's the book, right? The most recent book. But after grad school, I started using my scanner as a camera, and my scanner is right here in my studio, and it has been a tool that has allowed actually the objects of my world to speak. So I actually put objects, and it began, my first book was a book called Beach Stones, where I put a collection of stones on my scanner and worked with a wonderful geology writer named Margaret Carruthers, and put together a book called Beach Stones, and then I realized I can actually write these books myself. But the scanner lets me look very closely at these objects of my world, and it's that process of being deep in the pixels that all these questions start arising. Why does this stone look like a thumbprint? And then Margaret would write this wonderful description of the stone, or why. I mean, I have now evolved after a book called Beach, a Book of Treasure, which was the first book that I really researched and wrote myself for Chronicle Books back in 2010. Where I've really been using the beach as this place of discovery. It's a portal into our ocean world. And it was when I was making that book that I first held up a piece of seaweed to the sky. It was up at Duxbury Reef, and was just so flabbergasted by this intensity of form, this intensity of color. Here, this is some of the colors of the seaweeds here. This is from my book, An Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed, my first seaweed book. But it was that experience, and I still have it every time I go to the beach and hold seaweeds up to the sky. I'm like, oh, I have to get this onto my scanner. I use the transparency adapter of my scanner to push light through these seaweed specimens. So that's how I get this incredibly luminous. I'm able to capture their luminosity and color. So it's really the visual. It's the visual that takes me into the research and the writing and the storytelling. And when I started really making images of the seaweed, I realized, like, no one was telling their story. They're really an underrepresented part of our ocean world. When I proposed this book, An Ocean Garden, I made a beautiful proposal. Oh my God, I even made a maquette. I sent it off to Abrams, my publisher, and they sent it to their salespeople, and they laughed at me. They said, oh, you got to be kidding. We can't sell a book on seaweed. But it was too important. It was too beautiful and too interesting a story in terms of telling us some of the basic, fundamentals of our ocean science. So I've stuck with it. I'm super excited. Yeah, The Curious World of Seaweed is just been really the next dive and a much more substantial writing project. So this is 16 essays on iconic kelps and seaweeds of our Pacific coast. And as an artist, it is really the art making. One other thing I actually want to point out, though, is like you guys, I'm really curious how you guys work, is that I actually start with the visual and then I start building my books as I go along. I almost build them like a piece of sculpture in the computer. And then that's kind of what sparks this writing, the writing that goes along with it. Say, Obi, like how do you go about getting into the narrative? You write a lot. You're incredibly prolific. Do they go totally in tandem, or does the writings, the visuals spark the writing, or the experience spark the writing?
Well, there's actually two separate processes inside of the writing itself as a function. The first is an aesthetic one. Like, I am a student of calligraphy, like straight up the actual thing of writing. And I have a book. Here's this, so I'm all about searching for just a good looking word on the paper. For me, is an aesthetic experience. It's not unlike wildlife rendering. It's almost equivocal, if you will. It's like pushing fluid around on a piece of paper is endlessly fascinating to me when we're actually just talking about the presence of and weight of the written word itself is one aspect of it, sitting in practice, almost like especially over the past few months as I've sort of the longest stretch of my life without camping or backpacking, as I've sort of had to imagine all of these things as equivocal, because I'm not hiking and backpacking, which is actually my practice. I am letting the paint and the writing and finding good fonts. For me, this feels like hiking, if I can stretch the metaphor a little bit. And I'm all about the metaphor in my work, that actually traversing the waterfall from my brush, or the trail that my pen makes, or even just reading, my goodness, reading miles and miles of printed text can be equivocally satisfying to the idea of having an adventure. It's an inner adventure, but my goodness, if I haven't spent so many hours doing it over the past several months. This is my painting journal these days. I've done quite a bit of painting. I paint exactly the same size as my book, 5.5 by 7.5 inches. I've found my format, so I'm going to stick with it.
Emilie, what is your process in terms of moving into the writing from your artistic practice?
As a poet, it's very much about kind of surprising myself, listening to something on the news, seeing an image, having a little drawer where I keep buttons and stamps and things, and picking something up and kind of having the association take me somewhere, and being able to slow down in my mind the gap between observing something and making an explanation about it, and to really just notice and see where that comes from. So that's kind of the beginning. And then after that, there's a lot of revision behind me on the wall. I have chalkboard and magnet paint, so I can kind of put things up and revise and edit them. So that's my response as a poet. As an educator and curriculum developer, it's very much about bringing the learner on this journey of understanding. And so thinking a lot about sequencing, and trying to get a sense of, what is it that I'm really trying to invite this person to build an understanding of. And so that involves kind of a lot of rearranging ideas. Again, the sequencing of, what do I share first? How do I invite someone into thinking about something more deeply?
That's, really interesting. Jack, so maybe talk the two of you on how your book is, how you split the tasks of doing it together. Yeah.
I mean, Jack and I have taught together for maybe around 10 years at this point. So the content was there in terms of things that we were teaching, offering nature journaling as a tool to educators and teachers, which nature journaling, as Jack held up his journal earlier, is using words, pictures, and numbers to make discoveries and observe the outdoors. So we had built up a lot of ideas, and really a lot of the tasks were writing things down and trying to figure out what's a visual that we can put in the book, that can kind of support this idea. There was a lot of collecting journal entries from nature journalers and scientists that kind of exemplify what we hope that students can do in their own journals. And so it was it was a lot of work, and I would say that we were all very engaged. Each of us was really engaged in kind of all aspects of developing the book.
Mm-hmm.
Jack, do you want to add to that?
I guess something I do want to add to it that was really interesting is that how much I got out of a number of other projects I've done in the past. Like my first book was a field guide to the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it was about 1,700, I think, paintings of different bugs and squirrels and rabbits and trees and star charts, all the sort of stuff that you see as you're running around the mountains. And the process of making that one would be me wandering off into the wilderness, finding a wildflower that I hadn't seen before. Like, I haven't painted this one, sitting down, painting that one, researching it, figuring out what it is. And so it was kind of this monastic solitude. And then, that turned into a book. And so I had this sort of experience of bookmaking is this very kind of solo thing. And then I could get a little bit of the team when I then brought that to Heyday and we get together. But this, working on this project with you, was mind blowing, because you and we come together on all sorts of things, but then we have all these totally different ideas. And there would be these sort of moments of just sort of wonderful kind of contrast and struggle and just like, that's what you're saying? Yes. So the process of doing this with a buddy was amazing. And kind of, so it was a product of creating this thing where you have to really work together, really think about all sorts of things, but then getting to do that with somebody who just, on all sorts of levels, you helped me kind of see on a different level. It was a wonderful and very, very challenging at times, really, really hard. There were tears, all this sort of stuff. We even went into moderation together to kind of counseling for people who are trying to hatch a book. And there are times it was a struggle, and the result is such a cool thing. And so that made me really...
What you're describing, Jack, is exciting to me, because for me, that's the design process. That excitement of collaboration. And these books are each one of them is this very much of a designed product. And I feel like the word design isn't used that much in different media, but I feel like it's really important. It means collaboration and struggle and amalgamating different formats and different media. And working, I have to say, with Heyday has been fantastic in terms of doing a lot of the design work ourselves and then having them really catch on to what we're trying to get at and take it out into and make these really spectacular books. But as designers, we're also amalgamating all of this really, these scientific worlds. And I think it would be really interesting to talk about our relationship to the science, because we really are for artists, and we aren't. And yet, our books are very much rooted in the science of these topics that we're so passionate about. Jack, you want to try that one? Your relationship to the science as
sure. So for me, science is an absolutely beautiful process. It's a tool. It's an incredible tool for helping you kind of look a little bit more carefully at the world around you and trying to how do you figure things out in a way that is productive and moves the ball down the field. What does that look like? And it's an incredibly creative process. And I think that what scares a lot of people is that if you think of science as like this pile of information that's been recorded and is in a book somewhere, and you've got to memorize that to be good at science, we're intimidated by that because we haven't memorized everything in the book. But if instead you look at it as a process, a way of thinking, it's this incredibly creative, delightful process. So here's a journal entry that I made, and I'm wandering around in the forest, and I find this horizontal tree. So here's this horizontal tree, and it looks like a Roman numeral 3. And so first of all, the little scientist in me goes like, "Whoa, check that out! That's crazy!" And then there's these branches coming up from that. And so I'm thinking, like, what on earth is going on here? And if you're thinking about science as this pile of stuff that you have to have memorized, then this is really intimidating, because like, what on earth went on here? But instead, if you look at it as this kind of process of trying to figure out stuff, you have the permission to, so here's the evidence. Here's the evidence. And then down here is I've drawn in my explanation of what I think might have happened. And so I think that there was a big tree here and it fell over, but it was caught by other trees, and that held it up long enough for its actually a kind of a creeper vine. It set down some prop roots, and those took root, and then this part here broke off. So that's my explanation for it. I don't know if that's true, but I wrote this down, and I wrote, like, I think this is what's going on. This is my guess. And as long as I'm keeping my explanation separate from my observations, with those explanations, as long as I'm kind of holding it with kind of tentative language, saying, perhaps this, could it be this? All the mysteries of the world around me are open to my investigation. And I don't have to worry about being wrong. Science is not about, is not in the business of proving truth. It's the business of finding the best explanation for the data that you have at hand. And if a better explanation comes up, then I'm gonna flip over to that explanation. So I don't want to have any kind of loyalty to like, I'm gonna go with this one explanation no matter
and
what.
we're actually living that right now through this as the COVID, all this information there's nothing known. We're starting from ground zero. So we're seeing that process play out in real time, which is, I think, really interesting for the general public.
I think for me, that's a really, sorry, Obi, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, for you.
I think that's a really important piece for me in terms of my work as a science educator is I want students to know and young people to know that they can learn something right now through their own observations, observing something right out their doorstep, and know that that's valid knowledge, and use those critical thinking skills as they're engaging with the world around them and moving through their day. And I want them to learn about science as a process and understand the rigor that goes into a science investigation, because science is a really important tool, and particularly in terms of climate change and COVID, that's impacting the most marginalized groups in our world. And so kind of holding that polarity that, yes, you can learn something through your own observations right now, and that's doing science, and understanding kind of the greater context of where scientific information comes from. That's an important goal for me.
Gosh, I love your energy so much, Jack. It's so good. My father, Dr. William John Kaufmann III, was going to have a mathematician for a son. So I was. After I was, climbing waterfalls and playing with tarantulas all day on Mount Diablo in high school, I had to come home for 3 hours of calculus homework, so that was, he was training me how to understand reality that way. And a lot of, the word that the only word that I tripped up on a little bit was truth, right? Truth, like, okay, so astrophysicist, that's what my dad did. Like, check this out. This was my dad's book from 1979, Black Holes and Warped Space-Time. And check out this, like, I know this publisher says, from star birth to star death to the final cosmic reality where fact and fantasy merge. I love that because it kind of sounds like what I do. I just do it for California instead of, the cosmos. But, Neil deGrasse Tyson, another astrophysicist of note, says there's three kinds of truths. He says there's objective, there's political, and there's personal truths. Which is a very interesting schema to think about what we think is happening in the world, right? Especially when in the days of COVID, where you're intersecting all of these truths are having all of these different priorities, right? So it's often up to us in our job as communicators or interpreters, as you say, to sort of weed some of that out. And now the way that I do it is, the science in my books is really sort of presented mostly either as a journalist might, right? Because I really, really stress that my books are not works of research science, for example, because that helps me just take my shield and my license as an artist and wade into these deep waters of meanings how I want to, But, my data-driven stuff has to be like, so as in this book, in this new book, it's got 50 pages of notes now, unlike the California Field Atlas that didn't have many notes at all, That was me engaging in this place called California in my mind, but this is engaging in real ecological substance here, right? So like you were talking about design, Josie, but like here is here's my design of a Douglas fir seed from fertilization or creation to fertilization to germination over 17 months. So I designed this based on others' work, So while John, and Emily, you guys are the process of nature journaling, which I don't think is what I do, and maybe not what Josie does necessarily, is almost, it's like it's research art, if you will. I mean, I imagine that you have a couple of I don't know, a vocabulary words to describe your own process. But for me, I invented this new genre called a field atlas. So I'm not even
Right.
about.
It's fantastic. It's really a wonderful fabrication because it isn't something to take in the field. It's too, but I appreciate it because I have been making these books that are these visually driven books that have not been field very specifically. Also, they're not structured by anything more than the visual. And this new book, I couldn't do 2 kelps in a row because that's too much, golden color all at once. I have to get some color in there. So I have to interject a chapter on Maziella, the beautiful purpley seaweed. But I think it's also, though, you take for granted, I mean, I don't take for granted being able to find that information that makes it correct. I mean, we all owe it to our audience to be correct. We can't put things out there with the wrong name or a different life history than it actually is. And for me as a non-scientist coming into this field, I've really had to learn how to find my sources and how to read scientific papers and not understand them and read them again and again and again, and to learn a vocabulary that's very unfamiliar to me because I was a pure visual learner. Remembering names is impossible for me. So I don't even try to remember like names of plants on land because that might push out some of the algal names that I have in there. So it's been really important for me as I tell these natural history stories to not only kind of be able to read the scientific papers, but have these few key people in the science world that not only I trust implicitly, but they trust me. They really get this science and art and they appreciate it. And one of the wonderful things about working in the world of marine algae is that these scientists have been driven by this beauty from the start. That is what's driven their passion to go deep into the taxonomy, say, of a particular species of coralline algae. So to have that be communicated out to a broader audience is very appreciated. And then on the flip side, I'm able to kind of float certain stories past key people that I really, really value. Karina Nielsen, who's the director of the Estuarine and Ocean Science Center up in Romberg-Tiburon, is just such a magnificent science thinker. And Tristan McHugh, who's the head of the Reef Check group up in the North Coast, who's doing all this work on she's just a wonderful person to float these stories by. So that's for me as I'm really nervous. I want to get it right. I don't want to make a mistake. But on the other hand, though, Jack, to get back to your point about these evolving stories, this kelp forest story has changed so much just over the past 5 years. And being able to float a little bit outside the science and maybe go to a commission meeting and kind of raise your hand and ask an uncomfortable question because I don't have any agenda. The point, the specifics here is to watch the evolution of the story of the sea otter around the kelp forest story has been just fascinating to watch, because when I began thinking about the kelp forest, nobody on the North Coast, nobody was mentioning the word otter. Otter were persona non grata because of all of the abalone divers. Well, as the abalone fishery has really faded away and the importance of the kelp forest has come back, the story of the otter has made its way back into the kelp forest story. And even yesterday, I don't know, it was amazing. Yesterday on NPR, there was a tiny clip about all of the thinking that's going on up in British Columbia around sea otter and the kelp forest and how important the Indigenous First Nations voices are in thinking about long-term restoration. And there's some wonderful scientists. And this was the last chapter of my book that I had realized over the course of building this book was so important to figure out how we go into deep time to think about some of these ecological issues. And anyway, there's some wonderful First Nations voices that have been incorporated into the management and the science up in British Columbia. Anyway, it was kind of wonderful. But the science writing itself, the words we use, what do you guys think about that? I mean, that's, how we bridge our audiences. Emilie, what do you, how do you make sure you're using words that are both interesting but understandable in writing science for your audience?
I mean, I think I feel really lucky that the next generation science standards are a part of education right now. They're bold, progressive standards, and they focus on engaging students in what are called science and engineering practices. And there's 8 of them. And they're things like asking questions, constructing explanations, planning and carrying out investigations. And so there's some language that exists already in terms of sharing about these ideas of science in an education context. And that language is important, I think, partially because we can share that with students. And I find it really important to share with students in a writing context of, hey, we're asking questions, and that's something that scientists do. And holding up a mirror and showing that their learning behaviors are the same as scientists. So it's not kind of what Jack was talking about earlier of science is this stack of facts that you have to memorize. But in fact, the language that we use to talk about science can include the behaviors and the attitudes and the skills and the mindsets of a scientist, which is a way of connecting kind of things that we're doing every day to this idea of what science is.
Yeah, Emilie, I think your new book just cracks a nut wide open. I think that there's so much to talk about there. I am one of the only one in my circle of friends who reads textbooks for fun. That's really weird. Because I love to investigate that. Oh, okay. I suspect that you all are all different than most people.
You back there.
But I do I do as much reading as I do writing. I think it's just really important. And there's some amazing, and the language is always evolving, that we're talking about. Not like this book, Joan Didion's White Album, was hugely influential on this book, which is my second book, The State of Water, Understanding California's Most Precious Resource. I mean, she begins an analysis of water storage and conveyance across the state from a late 70s point of view. That's fascinating. But you think about biological poets like Robin Wall Kimmerer or Diane Ackerman who are using I guess it was Diane Ackerman who said biologically accurate poetry, which is a brain twister for sure. This book came out last year, and this book has a lot. This is by a German forester, and he intentionally warps the language, the traditional language of how we talk about tree science, and introduces a lot of anthropomorphic vocabulary in order to describe how, on a similar level, what Jack was talking about with this is what I think happened. He's talking about, after being in the German forest and watching it evolve over the same forest over 30 or 40 years, how he gets to know these trees as having a language of their own, for example, and having reactions that are not unlike animal reactions. They're just slower and different. So it's a different set of perception skills and a different language. The other book that blew my mind this year, as far as that goes, is this book, which was number one fiction for all year long. I have not cried so hard at a novel in years. This floored me. This book, where you, like, I almost felt like he was messing with my mind. Like there was like mycelial connections in the expert way that the sentences themselves were structured, if that's at all possible. And I don't know if it is or not. And I don't care.
One of the things I think is so interesting about this and the writing, and I think of the journaling, is how, to me, as a writer of the natural world, we bring ourselves into it. We to bring the experience, to make the experience really real. But it's a very fine line, because it's very easy to get solipsistic, and then it all kind of crashes to the ground. So for me, that's something. The voice for me is Rachel Carson, who, I mean, talk about being able to synthesize a textbook. Oh my God! And she had only one experience going. And if everyone doesn't know, she wrote about the ocean before Silent Spring. She wrote 3 books on the ocean that were profound and, for me, foundational. But there's always her, even though she's synthesizing all this science, her experience at the shore is what is driving it. And she only had one little experience of going underwater, and it was very short, but it was enough for her to then have empathy for this world. But Jack, what I love about your journal is that it always has the mark of your hand, or nature journaling in general, is that it intrinsically has the mark of the author in it. And there's something that's, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, or sometimes, here's me, the observer. And then that also gives you a sense of scale.
Right.
So that is something that is very useful to keep in mind as you're exploring things. That this is that as you're trying to figure stuff out, your personal experience and the feelings that you have about something are your brain tends to really heavily weight those personal experiences. And so as a species, we don't respond to data, right? If I showed you a graph and a table about something, your brain would go like, yeah. Tell me an anecdote. Tell me a personal anecdote that makes this story personal. But the problem with anecdotes is that we can get into a lot of trouble when we use an anecdote as evidence. Mm-hmm. An anecdote can be incredibly powerful for telling a story and helping somebody understand something. But the anecdote is dangerous, because the anecdote will, when I tell you a convincing story, we'll go like, oh, we're a species that's set up to sit around the fire and listen to a compelling story and learn from that. We're not set up to see a graph and its mean and standard deviation, and it looks like, and so we end up making lots of decisions that are not data-driven and evidence-driven. So something that is interesting in this process is how can you are going out, you're having your personal experiences, and then you also have to notice, okay, that's a sample size of 1.
Right.
And what are the implications of that? And looking at a larger sample set, and what is the consensus of science coming to on these, as you have people all over the place. And I think, Obi, you do a really beautiful job of that, because what you're actually doing is you're there and you're looking at all the data, all the science, and then you're turning that into a compelling visual, right? You can take that, you can form it into a map, and I can look at that map and I can go like, bing, I get it. And so I think that kind of is a neat example of kind of walking this line between, how you can present something either with an anecdote, or I turn that into a powerful information graphic, and very powerful communication tools. But then just sort of realizing that my personal experience, which is how I get around the world, right, is from this perspective. But then how does that really kind of translate into evidence? Those are really,
and the storytelling, that's really good writing, or science writing, and to me, or this is crafting, is being able to use that to bring us not into our world, but take us into the natural world. But we need to hear a few footsteps to get us there. That's where the visual can do it. The visual is a great
and the story
kind of opener up to the story. What I've found is that also the history of the science is really interesting and has these personal stories, and it's about the investigation, and then that can take you into, well, what have we built up over this time from, the history of the life cycle of the seaweed is absolutely fascinating. And it was this one woman in England who really cracked a huge nut back in 1949. And this, her investigation opened up a whole world for the nori farmers in Japan. And we now know the science of the life cycle of nori, but by telling her story, and that's fantastic. And for me, also having the visual representation of the history of science is another kind of way in.
What was the name of the woman who?
Oh, Kathleen Drew Baker.
Kathleen Drew Baker, and she figured out how essentials of seaweed reproduction.
The red seaweeds, of which nori is one of the red category, have a very, very complex life cycle that has an alternate generation that can look completely different from the nori that we know. And nobody knew that these two different looking things, which were thought to be different species, were actually different parts of the same life cycle until she worked it out. And she was a woman. She was denied. Her professorship was retracted because she was married. She continued to do her research, and she wrote up a very small paper that was then read by these scientists in Japan who were struggling. The nori farms were in great kind of a state of catastrophe, actually, because of pollution runoff. And anyway, so it's this wonderful story. She's actually honored in Japan to this day as kind of the mother of the sea and a real savior to the nori industry. But so it's a great, we know that story is, the science has been done and it's been looked at and confirmed. But that is a way into that is very appealing. I mean, I think maybe we also might kind of transition at this point, though, as to kind of what our goals are, or where we think these books fit in our present conversations about our natural world, about the social upheaval that's going on, and kind of wrap up that way. I have some ideas. Does anyone want to throw anything out there?
Sure. Yeah. I'm a conservationist. I want to protect what is still here. And there's a lot still here. And it's my conviction that people protect what they love, and people love what they know and what they understand. So that's a good inroad for me as far as, sort of a mission statement. But now, I'm really realizing, even as, I don't have a long history in social activism, for example, but I do understand that there is a lot coming to light. And one of the things that I'm so ready and excited to talk about again and again on those very uncomfortable discussions that we should be having about, how my own privilege within this world, this modern society, has shaped my perspective. because now it seems clear that, and of course it is clear, that without racial and social justice, there can be no environmental and climate justice, which I think is something that should be said again
over
and again. So that's just my 2 cents there. Especially in this circle of friends, we should certainly acknowledge that this very excellent moment in history where we have minds are changing. I heard today on NPR that Merriam-Webster is changing the definition of racism in the dictionary, which is fantastic. Talk about huge symbols that we're passing around about who we are and who we think we are.
Emilie, your thoughts on? I've noticed one of the things is that you, and in fact, I just downloaded it. You have your book available as a PDF on your website. Can you talk about that and this, where we, and also just the broader time we're in?
Yeah, that was an intention from the beginning. When Jack and I started this book, we wanted it to be downloadable, as a free PDF, so it could be as accessible as possible. And we decided to kind of make that happen sooner than intended when COVID hit. And I think a lot of people are gravitating to nature journaling right now. This is a leaf from my yard that I've been observing over the last week or so. And the cool thing about nature journaling is they are tools for being with whatever's in front of you. And there's been an idea, I think, in nature writing and in kind of the outdoor industry in general, that the outdoors and, nature is only found in wilderness, or is only valid if it's something you go to as opposed to something that you're studying that's around you all the time. And so I'm grateful to kind of have nature journaling be one way that one set of tools, one set of mindsets of attention and curiosity and wonder that we can use to be present and have a relationship with whatever's in front of us, and to notice what it's like for us to be in that relationship, which I think is an essential skill as we're just building more awareness of ourselves within the context of the world right now.
Well said.
There was one of the parts of creating this. If you look at the book on teaching how to teach nature journaling, you will see lots of examples from kids that look like all the different ways that kids can look. You will see there's actually a lot of very intentional thought in the book about how to phrase the activities and present what we're doing in ways that will be relevant and accessible to not just people who have skin color like mine, but to all the youth out there. And Emilie is I think really responsible for having that so prevalent in our book. There were some really, for me, initially very challenging discussions, and she felt comfortable pushing me in difficult discussions that made for a better book and a more inclusive format. And it was really interesting to me, as I'm a white male. There were things, and I thought, I think everybody sort of thinks like I'm woke, right? But Emilie helped me see gaps where I wasn't really seeing a full picture. I was wondering if you might just sort of talk a little bit, Emilie, about some of the things that were deliberate to make a book that would be more inclusive for everybody who picked it up.
I want to be mindful of time. I know we're coming to the end of our time, and Josie, want to make sure that you get a chance to share. But appreciate, just appreciate that, Jack, and know that there's a lot that I would do differently, even having finished the book, less than a year ago. There's ways that my own understanding has grown and changed, and stuff I know we missed, and things I would do differently in the future. If you do want to learn a little bit about kind of thinking about inclusion and equity and representation in the context of the outdoors, I would definitely go follow Jose Gonzalez, who's doing amazing work and has been doing that for a long time. Dr. Carolyn Finney, Teresa Baker. There's a lot of great work happening there and a lot of great people to listen to.
Yeah,
I just wanted to send also just a thank you to you, Emilie, in this process for being strong and being an advocate for those things that you were important, being willing to have difficult conversations. And I think that the more that those sorts of conversations are happening all over our country, they change the way we think, and having it come through somebody that I trust and that I have a relationship with was a way of really helping me see things in a way that was different by the end of the process, and that was very powerful for me. So thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that, and I think the skills that we're offering in terms of curiosity and awareness about when we're studying the outdoors and nature are really the same tools that we can use kind of when we're investigating our own biases and trying to build our awareness of the impacts that we're having.
Absolutely, and I think it's a time of learning, and I'm very much looking to a younger generation, kind of trying to step back and listening to as much as I can. I think one of the things, I heard a great phrase, I think it's actually from the mental health world, called cultural humility. And I was thinking about cultural humility and how it's connected to environmental humility. And this environmental humility is very much about, for me, the root of my book, both these books, especially as it pertains to the algal world, is how do we step back and say, this is not about me. This is about, in this case, this foundational organisms. It's not, I'm not going to write about it because it can feed us, or it can become biofuel, or we can farm it, or it can do all these things for us. I've really rejected that and said, how do we keep it algal centric? And the amount of this, it all started with this crazy guy here. This is a piece of feather boa kelp that I just scanned. And it's not, this is what it looks like in our world, which is not its world, but when it's in the water, it's spectacular. And it's, how can we build empathy for something that is hard to understand? And this building empathy, I listened to Jericho Brown's wonderful conversation on Unbound, and he was talking about the Black experience as being has kind of training Black writers and Black folk to be outside themselves. And I was thinking how valuable so many thinkers will be in terms of changing our viewpoints on how to approach our world in general. So I think our natural world is out there waiting, not waiting, it is there. It's doing its thing. I'm not being very good at wrapping it up here, but building empathy. And that's what it's all about. So thanks, you guys. Thanks again to Obi and Jack Laws, Emilie Lygren for joining us. At the end of this talk, there will be a link where you can buy the California Field Atlas, The State of Water, How to Teach Nature Journaling, and my own book, The Curious World of Seaweed. And they will be shipped directly to you. So I'm Josie Iselin, and you've been watching the Bay Area Book Festival Unbound.